Mr. Abdelrazik is now home, but he's not free. His struggle is far from over, unfortunately. There's two things that we're now working on as Project Fly Home, his support group in Montreal. One is to hold someone accountable, hold the people who are responsible for this accountable for what they've done. This is unfortunately not an isolated case. Here are 3 other men to whom a very similar thing happened. Mr. Al-Malki, Mr. Nuruddin, and Mr. Al-Mati were all arrested overseas with the complicity of the Canadian government. They were brutally tortured before they returned home to Canada as well. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I think these cases are particularly extreme, but there's a broad pattern underlying this. One which is about some Canadians being more Canadian, having rights than other Canadians, some people being treated as though they're worth more than other people. And we've seen that in many different ways, obviously throughout Canadian history, but since the war on terror was declared, I think we've seen this really focused on Muslim and Arabs in Canada particularly. And we need to, I think, begin in many ways to speak out and stand up against this. Mr. Abdelrazik has launched different ways of trying to hold those responsible in order to stop this trend or to stand up against this trend. He's, just quickly say before I turn to the main part of what I want to talk about, he's launched a lawsuit, and this lawsuit is important because it doesn't just hold the government of Canada accountable, or it's not aimed at just holding them accountable. It's personally named Lawrence Cannon, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time when many of us bought a plane ticket to send to Mr. Abdelrazik so that he could travel home. And on the very morning that he was supposed to board that plane, Lawrence Cannon, who was the Foreign Affairs Minister, said, "No, I'm refusing to give him a travel document." And he sent a 2-line curt letter, extremely disrespectfully, the same morning to his lawyer saying that he's not going to get on that plane. This was of huge disappointment and was a very difficult time for Mr. Abdelrazik. And Lawrence Cannon was involved for that whole period during the 14 months when he was in the embassy. And so I think it's very important symbolically that as a person he's being held responsible, or he will be held responsible through this lawsuit. What I really want to focus on, though, is the 1267 regime. We mentioned several times that Mr. Abdelrazik's name was placed in 2006 on a list. This is a United Nations Security Council list, and it was created in 1999. It was first focused on who the Americans were holding responsible for the bombing of their embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. So it was focused on the Taliban or people associated with or thought to be associated with the Taliban. And then it was expanded to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So it's now called the Taliban and Al-Qaeda list. And the Taliban and Al-Qaeda list does 3 things, 2 of which we're concerned with. One is the asset freeze, and the second one is the international travel ban. I'll just give you a little example of what it is to live under both of those. An asset freeze means that in Canada, the way it works is that if someone pays Mr. Abdelrazik a salary for work he does, they could be charged criminally in Canada and receive up to 10 years. So that the outcome of that is a complete asset freeze on him. The only way he can have access to any kind of financial resources is by asking for an exemption, going to the United Nations Security Council 1267 committee based in New York and asking for an exemption. So an international travel ban means, for example, say his mother gets sick again, he will not be able to travel to see his mother. I want to talk just in a little more detail, just so you can understand the extent of this regime, the 1267 regime, about how you get on and how you get off. In a word, it's easily on, almost impossible to get off. It's a preventive list. It's explicitly a preventive list. What does that mean? It means that there are no criminal charges. It means that a crime doesn't even have to have taken place. It's based on an alleged association. So it's about profiling and association. It's about who you are and who you may know, and it's not about what you've done. There are no standards or mechanisms. How it works is that one of the members of the Security Council has some information. It brings that information to the Security Council and says, we want to put this person on the list. There are no mechanisms for verifying that any of that information is true. There's no standards of evidence. There's no standards of proof. It is not. There's no resemblance to anything that we would consider some kind of a fair trial or fair process. And obviously there's no hearing. You're just suddenly on the list. You haven't been told beforehand. You haven't been given a chance to respond. You're just on the list. Importantly, listed people are often not given any reason why they're on the list. Information can and typically is kept secret. So you may have absolutely no reason why you're on this list. And that was Mr. Abdelrazik's case for the first 3 years. Between 2006 and 2009, he was told not one word about why he was on this list. In 2009, when his case was blowing up a scandal in Canada and it was all over the media, oops, suddenly the 1267 committee thought it was just about time to give him some information about why he's on this list. So a paragraph appeared on the website of the 1267 committee. And that is the only information he has about why he's on this list, this one paragraph. Not one shred of evidence has ever been provided to substantiate any of the claims in that paragraph. And I just want to look at the chief claim in that paragraph is that he is supposed to know someone called Mr. Abu Zubaydah. There's several problems with that claim. The claim is that he is supposed to know Abu Zubaydah, and Abu Zubaydah is supposed to be a high-ranking official in the Al-Qaeda network. So first problem is he doesn't know Abu Zubaydah. Second problem is that Mr. Abu Zubaydah, according to the U.S. Justice Department's current position, as opposed to the position when he was put on the list, that he has nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. The Justice Department of the U.S. now takes a position that Mr. Zubaydah is not linked to Al-Qaeda, wasn't a member, may not share his ideology, never was a member. So you have this bizarre situation where Mr. Abdelrazik is on the list because he's supposed to know someone who's supposed to link him to Al-Qaeda. But now that person that he's supposed to know, they say no longer has a link to Al-Qaeda. Nevertheless, he's still on the list. And the third problem with this claim is that you may have heard this name. It's a name that's been in the media a lot because he was severely tortured by the CIA's torture program. And this is something that George Bush publicly said. He cited him as an example of the kind of treatment that people who were being interrogated by the CIA had undergone. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, this is not according to the human rights organizations, this is according to the U.S. Department of Justice, he was waterboarded 83 times during August 2002. Waterboarding being the form of torture where it's simulated drowning, so you feel like you're about to die. And that's the kind of treatment. So if you can imagine how worthless any information coming from that source is. Do you know Abdelrazik? Yes. Of course, I know anything. I'm God, you know. Anything you want to hear, I will tell you if you will stop this pain. And, of course, Canadian courts have recognized that any information from Mr. Zubaydah is worthless, and they do not use that. In the security certificate cases, they were trying to use information sourced to Abu Zubaydah. They do not use that information anymore. That's been thrown out. But that is the source of information, we assume, we don't know much about it, obviously, of why Mr. Abdelrazik's on the list.